I was scrolling through a heated comment section the other day. I mean, you know the type where these two people were just going at it over a local zoning law?
Yeah, the most passionate debate.
Absolutely. And within, I think, 3 replies, one of them had already dropped the H-bomb. He called the city council head literally Hitler.
Of course.
And it was so casual, you know? It felt almost lazy. It's like we've gotten to this point where everyone from, I don't know, world leaders like Putin to the guy who cuts you off in traffic gets slapped with that same label.
It's the ultimate shorthand for evil.
And, you know, Godwin's law says every online argument eventually ends up there. But then I started thinking about this headline I saw. It was from a 1933 edition of the Baltimore Sun.
Okay, so right as Hitler was consolidating power.
Exactly. And obviously the journalists back then couldn't call him Hitler. I mean, he hadn't become the monster we know yet, so they had to reach for something else.
They had a different toolkit.
A much deeper, more colorful one. They warned that this new leader should remember Napoleon and how his coup eventually collapsed. And it just gave me this strange realization. Before 1945, the world didn't have its ultimate villain.
Point.
If you wanted to call a politician a bloodthirsty tyrant in, say, the 1920s, you didn't reach for a swastika, you'd call them a modern-day Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun reborn.
Right, or if they were arrogant and out of touch.
They were Nero fiddling while the city burned. If they were a threat to democracy, they were a new Caesar. And it feels like the way we insult our leaders has actually become smaller, less descriptive. Yeah, we've traded this whole library of historical tyrants, you know, biblical oppressors, mad emperors, for just one name. And it really makes you wonder, how did we lose the pharaohs and the Robespierres of our political vocabulary? And I mean, what does it say about us that we've narrowed all of human evil down to a single man? Now, I have to be honest with you. When I first had that thought that our insults are shrinking, it felt a bit like a shower thought, you know? Back in my day, we had better insults.
For a bit of old man yells at cloud.
Exactly. But then I started digging into the stack of research we have for today, and I realized this isn't just about name-calling. It's not just about us being lazy with our words. It feels like we are looking at a fundamental rewiring of how we process political conflict.
It is certainly more than just a decline in vocabulary. It is, I think, a decline in the architecture of our thought. Yeah. You're right to frame it as a rewiring.
The architecture of our thought.
When you lose the words to describe specific shades of political malice, you lose the ability to see them. It's what some linguists might argue. If you don't have a word for a concept, you can't really think the concept.
So if the only word you have for bad leader is Hitler,
then every bad leader becomes an existential threat. And that kind of threat requires a total war response. There's no room for nuance.
Right, and that's the mission we are on today. We are trying to figure out how this collapse happened, and frankly, looking at these notes, I'm a little intimidated. We aren't just talking about history, we are talking about psychology, the therapeutic state, whatever that means, and something called intellectual anomie.
Anomie is a heavy hitter for sure, but don't be intimidated, I promise. These concepts are actually describing things we see every single day, on Twitter, in town halls, probably at family dinners.
Okay, well, let's start with the before picture, because if we are saying we lost a scalpel and replaced it with a sledgehammer, we need to know what that scalpel looked like.
We need to define our terms.
Yeah, and I want to share a story I came across that really sets the scene for what the intellectual world used to look like before this flattening happened.
Okay.
I heard this story about a young postgraduate student at Oxford in the late 1960s. This was a time when, you know, the echoes of the great books still lingered in those drafty hallways before what some call the Great Purge of the canon.
A very different academic environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he apparently spent his afternoons debating whether a local politician's land grab was more reminiscent of the Roman prescriptions under Sulla or the enclosure movements of the Tudors.
Wow. That's a deep cut for a local zoning issue.
To him, history was this vast, crowded room of distinct personalities, and each one offered a specific warning about the human soul. But as the decades rolled by, he watched the bookshelves in the faculty lounge grow lighter, replaced by pamphlets of immediate grievance. And by the time he retired, his students no longer knew who Sulla was. When they saw something they disliked, they had only one word left in their vocabulary: Hitler. Tragedy. The structural decline of classical education has stripped us of our scalpels, leaving us only with a sledgehammer. And I look at this story and I feel this profound sense of, well, that term you used, intellectual anomie. When we lose the nuance of the past, we lose the ability to describe the present without just screaming. It sounds a little bit like Old Man Yells at Cloud, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Kids these days don't know who Sulla is. Does it really matter if a college student can't reference a Roman dictator from 80 BC? Is that actually a crisis, or is it just a change in curriculum?
Yeah. If it were just about trivia, about knowing dates and names to win a game of Jeopardy, then no, it wouldn't matter at all.
It's not about being a know-it-all.
But the story points to something much deeper, which is the loss of a comparative framework. Think about what that student was actually doing in the 1960s. He was debating, is this politician acting like Sulla, or is he acting like the tutors?
Right. He's comparing and contrasting. He's trying to find the best fit.
Exactly. And that very act requires you to understand motives. Sulla did what he did for very different reasons than Henry VIII did. The prescriptions were about eliminating political rivals for cash. The enclosures were about, agricultural efficiency and consolidating aristocratic power.
Two completely different kinds of greed or power plays.
If you can't distinguish between those motives, you can't understand the problem you're facing today. The decline of classical education wasn't just about removing old dusty books from a shelf. It was a structural shift in how we believe character is formed.
Okay, what do you mean by that? How character is formed? That's big.
Well, for centuries, really since the Renaissance, there was this prevailing idea in Western education. We can call it the metaphor of refinement.
The metaphor of refinement. Okay.
You see it in the writings of people like Petrarch or Sir Philip Sidney. The idea was that education was an almost mechanical process of purification. Imagine taking a rough piece of ore and refining it into pure gold.
Okay, so the student is the ore.
The student is the ore. And the process, the furnace, is rubbing up against the great texts. The belief was that if you forced a young man to read Virgil, to read Cicero, Homer, to translate them, memorize them, live in their world, that constant contact would physically and morally alter him.
It sounds almost like a contagion of virtue.
A contagion of virtue. The idea was you read heroic thoughts, therefore you become a hero. You study the structures of a republic in Cicero, and you become a good Republican citizen.
It's a really nice theory. Read the Aeneid, become a good citizen. Simple. But I'm sensing a very large but is coming.
A massive but. The 20th century took a sledgehammer, to use our term, to the entire theory. Just think about the generation that led Europe into World War I. Think about the generation that orchestrated the Holocaust.
The officers, the generals, the bureaucrats, the guys running the show.
These were the most highly educated men in the history of the world, classically speaking. We are talking about men who could translate 40 lines of Virgil before breakfast. They knew Sulla. They knew Caesar. They knew the Bible inside and out.
Yeah.
These were not uncultured brutes.
They were the refined gold from the theory.
And yet they marched the world into a meat grinder. They designed logistical systems for mass murder with the same intellectual rigor they applied to Greek verse.
So the metaphor of refinement turned out to be, well, a complete failure. Nonsense, even.
Yes. The Holocaust was the final, undeniable nail in the coffin. It proved that you can be incredibly cultured, literate, and knowledgeable about history and still participate in, or at the very least fail to stop, industrial-scale murder.
That must have been a devastating realization for a university system to have about its own purpose.
It caused a total crisis of confidence in the academy, especially in the humanities. The argument became, if the old humanities didn't stop Auschwitz, what good are they? They were seen as, at best, useless ornamentation, and at worst, a kind of moral anesthetic.
So in response, the universities basically threw the baby out with the bathwater.
They decided that if the canon didn't guarantee morality, then we shouldn't privilege it anymore. We should focus on more immediate, relevant, and critical perspectives.
Which makes sense on one level.
Yes. But in the process, as that story illustrates, we stopped teaching the laborer of villains. We stopped teaching the nuances of Sulla and Nero and Robespierre because that whole system of thought was viewed as suspect, as failed.
But the problem is we didn't replace it with a new nuanced framework.
We just left a void.
And that void is where the sociologist Emile Durkheim comes in. You mentioned anomie earlier.
Yes, Emile Durkheim, one of the fathers of sociology. He used the term anomie to describe a state of normlessness. But it's deeper than just having no rules. It's the psychological distress that comes from not having a framework to categorize your experience.
Okay, so it's a feeling of being untethered.
Imagine you're in a room where the laws of physics keep changing. You'd feel panicked, right? Anomie's like that, but for social and moral rules. When you don't have the words or the categories to understand what is happening to you, you feel lost. You feel panicked.
So let me see if I'm tracking this. If I see a politician doing something bad and I have a library of villains in my head, I can say, he's being a Nero. And that categorizes him. It puts him in a box. It tells me what kind of problem this is.
It's a diagnosis. You have scalpels. You can dissect the behavior. This part is vanity. This part is incompetence. You understand the pathology.
But if you have no library, if you're living in this state of intellectual anomie,
then every bad thing feels like the worst thing. You have no scale. A zoning law you don't like isn't just incompetent or greedy. It feels like the end of the world. It feels like an existential crisis because you lack the intermediate categories to place it in. Everything is a 1 or a 10.
And that 10 is always Hitler.
That 10 is always Hitler.
I want to test this because I think we assume we know what these old insults mean, but I bet we've lost the specific flavors. I think it would be useful to reopen that library of villains for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll throw some scenarios at you, and you tell me which historical villain fits the bill pre-1945. 1. You have a leader who is incredibly vain. He's obsessed with his public image. He thinks he's a great artist. He's maybe a little bit of a buffoon. He is completely ignoring a massive crisis, let's say a pandemic or a financial crash, because he's too busy staging photo ops and singing his own praises. In 2024, people would call him Hitler. But in 1924...
that is a classic Nero, without a doubt.
Nero, the guy who fiddled while Rome burned.
Right. And notice the specificity. Calling someone a Nero doesn't mean they are a systematic mass murderer. It means they are a decadent narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the Nero isn't that he wants to kill everyone. It's that he doesn't care if everyone dies, as long as he gets to perform on his lyre and look good.
That is a huge distinction, because you handle a narcissist completely differently than you handle a murderer.
Completely. The solution to a Nero is ridicule, exposure, voting him out. It's not total war.
1. You have a leader who is obsessed with virtue, capital V. He wants to purify the nation. He believes in the people as an abstract idea, but he's perfectly willing to chop off the heads of actual living people to serve his idea of the people. He's not corrupt. In fact, he's famously incorruptible, lives a simple life, but he is terrifyingly ruthless in his pursuit of a perfect society.
That is Robespierre.
The French Revolution guy.
Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible. In 1934, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch actually ran an editorial calling Hitler a Robespierre.
Specific, what does that imply that Hitler doesn't?
It implies a ruthless reformer, a fanatic. It suggests someone who kills not for personal gain or sadistic pleasure, but for a cause, for an ideology of purity. It's a warning about the dangers of utopianism, which is a very different danger from, say, Nero's selfish decadence.
Okay, so we have the decadent narcissist, Nero, and the ruthless reformer, Robespierre. What about the biblical ones? You hear Pharaoh or Herod thrown around in older texts.
Well, those carry a different kind of weight. It's theological. A Pharaoh or a Herod is specifically an oppressor of the innocent. The image is very specific. Slaughtering children, as Herod was said to have done, or enslaving a minority, like Pharaoh.
So it's not just a political insult. It's invoking a sense of cosmic injustice.
Exactly. It's a call for divine intervention. It frames the struggle as good versus evil on a biblical scale, which again requires a different response than just a political one.
And finally, the ones that sound the most brutal. Attila. Genghis Khan.
The barbarian at the gate. This was used constantly in Allied propaganda in World War I against Kaiser Wilhelm. It implies an enemy of civilization itself.
So the idea is they want to destroy, not to rule.
The barbarian wants to burn the library. He doesn't want to read the books or even rewrite them. He represents chaos and savagery against order and culture.
So here's the tragedy laid bare. We had this incredible menu of political pathologies. We had incompetent vanity, ideological fanaticism, theocratic oppression, and civilizational chaos. Distinct flavors, distinct diagnoses.
Each requiring a different medicine.
And we took all of that and threw it in a blender and poured it into a single cup labeled Hitler.
And by doing that, we lost the solutions. Because as we said, you solve a Nero problem with ridicule or voting. You solve a Robespierre problem with counter-revolution or by moderating the ideology. You might pray for deliverance from a Pharaoh, but you only solve a Hitler problem one way.
Total war. Annihilation.
Exactly. You don't negotiate with absolute evil. You don't compromise with the devil. You eradicate him. And that brings us to the mechanism of how this works in our modern discourse. It's not just an insult anymore, it's a logical trap.
This is where we get into the heavy philosophy. I'm seeing the name Leo Strauss in our notes. Reductio ad Hitlerum.
Strauss, a political philosopher, coined this term in 1953. It's a very specific type of logical fallacy.
Exactly.
The basic absurd structure is Hitler liked dogs, You like dogs,
Right.
therefore you are a Nazi.
Right. Okay.
It's obviously silly when you put it that way, but in political arguments, it's used as a serious weapon.
Yeah.
Hitler supported gun control, or Hitler built the Autobahn, a centralized highway system, or Hitler was a nationalist who cared about national pride.
So if you support any of those things,
Then you are on the path to Auschwitz. It's a way to associate a policy you dislike with an absolute moral horror, thereby short-circuiting any rational debate about the policy's actual merits or flaws.
it shuts down thinking.
Completely. We all know Godwin's law, the idea that every online argument eventually degrades into a Nazi comparison. But one of the articles in our stack brought up a term I hadn't heard before, and I actually laughed out loud when I read it. The Nazi card laughs. It is absurd, isn't it? But it's a perfect description of a real rhetorical move.
It sounds like we're playing Uno. I played the Nazi card. But I counter with the reverse Nazi card.
That is literally what happens in a debate. The Nazi card is the counter move. Person A says, this policy is basically what the Nazis did.
Okay, that's the Nazi card.
Then person B, instead of defending the policy, says, oh, there you go, playing the Nazi card. Only hysterical, unserious people do that. You've lost the argument by making an inappropriate comparison. I win.
So the debate stops being about the policy entirely.
100%. It becomes a debate about the rules of the debate. It's a meta-argument. Once the Nazi card is played, we are no longer discussing zoning laws or healthcare. We are discussing rhetorical etiquette and who is being more reasonable.
And it allows the person being accused to completely dodge the accusation without actually answering it.
It's a perfect get-out-of-jail-free card for a bad argument.
But surely there are times when the comparison is valid. Or are we saying we should never ever use it? The whole point of never again is to spot the parallels before it's too late?
That is the incredibly difficult line to walk. And the sources we looked at are helpful here. They tend to distinguish between two different categories of Hitler rhetoric. There is ridicule and there is denigration.
Okay, so ridicule is the soup Nazi from Seinfeld.
Right. Or calling someone a grammar Nazi. Or that meme where Elon Musk compared Justin Trudeau to Hitler, but then added a joke that Hitler had a budget.
Which, I mean, that's just edgy humor, right? Is there any real harm in that?
Well, some scholars and organizations, like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, would argue that, yes, there is harm. They argue it creates what's called epistemic violence.
Epistemic violence. That sounds very academic, like it means it hurts my feelings.
It's a bit deeper than that. Epistemic means related to knowledge. So the violence is against knowledge itself. The argument is that when you turned Hitler into a meme, when you make him a punchline about soup or grammar or national budgets, you are eroding the knowledge of what the Holocaust actually was.
You're trivializing it.
You're trivializing industrial slaughter. If a Nazi is just a guy who is really strict about his soup or corrects your spelling, then the word has lost its unique horror. The currency has been devalued.
Okay. Denigration. That's the serious use of the term.
That's when it's used as a weapon. That is Putin calling the Ukrainian government Nazis. That is not a joke. That is a justification for invasion. It's framing the enemy as an existential threat that must be eliminated for the good of the world. That's the total war trigger we talked about earlier.
Or when people compare U.S. border policies to Auschwitz.
Exactly. That's not meant as ridicule. It's meant to frame the other side as the embodiment of absolute unforgivable evil.
This brings me to the part of the research that I found the most difficult to wrap my head around, but also maybe the most rewarding. The philosophy of evil. We have this distinction that comes from thinkers like Kant and Hannah Arendt. Demonic evil versus radical evil.
This is where we have to slow down because the terms are very counterintuitive, especially the word radical.
Right, because when I hear radical, I think extreme, like totally radical dude in the 80s or radical terrorist today.
Exactly. But Kant was using it in its original Latin sense. Root.
So root evil, as in the root of evil.
Yes. Human evil. Evil that is rooted in our nature. It's the potential for evil that exists within the human condition itself.
Okay. And demonic evil, that one seems more straightforward.
Demonic evil is the idea of a monster, a supernatural beast, something wholly other, a devil, a creature from another dimension that has nothing in common with us.
So when I call a politician Hitler in an argument, which one am I using?
You are almost always, implicitly, using the demonic frame. You are saying, that person is a monster. They are not human like me. They are a different species of being.
Because that feels good. It feels safe. If he is a monster and I am a human, then I can't possibly be like him.
Exactly. It is a profound act of psychological exculpation. We use the Hitler label to exonerate ourselves from any complicity. If Hitler is a demon, then the fact that I am a bureaucrat who just follows orders, or that I stand by when I see injustice, well, that's fine, because I don't have horns and a tail.
But Hannah Arendt, she went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. She looked at an actual high-level Nazi architect of the Holocaust, and she didn't see a demon.
No. Famously, she saw a mediocre man, a bland bureaucrat, a joiner. She saw the banality of evil.
The banality of evil.
She saw that radical evil, the root evil, is actually boring. It's paperwork. It's following the rules. It's careerism. It's doing what your boss tells you to do to get a promotion, even if that job happens to be organizing the train schedules to send millions of people to their deaths.
So, by calling everyone Hitler in the demonic sense, we are actually blinding ourselves to the real Nazi danger, the danger she saw.
Yes, that's the terrifying irony. We are looking for horns and pitchforks, while the real evil is wearing a gray suit and sitting in a cubicle, trying to improve efficiency. We turn the Nazis into a myth, a cartoon, which effectively protects us from confronting the potential for Eichmann within ourselves and within our own systems.
That is deeply uncomfortable. It means the Hitler insult is actually a defense mechanism for our own egos. It's a way to avoid looking in the mirror.
I think that's a very powerful way to see it.
And speaking of defense mechanisms and psychology, that leads us directly into our next segment. We've talked about the history, the loss of vocabulary, and the philosophy behind it. Now I want to talk about the psychology, this idea of the therapeutic state.
This is a major cultural shift that's happened in the last 40 or 50 years, and it's essential to understanding why the Hitler analogy is so powerful now.
I have another story here that I think perfectly captures how this plays out on the ground in a real-world setting. I saw a post online recently about a town hall meeting in a small American suburb. You know, the kind of place Christopher Lasch might have analyzed in his studies on narcissism. A local councilman proposed a complex and, albeit flawed, zoning reform to address housing shortages.
Okay, standard, boring local politics.
Exactly. But instead of a debate on infrastructure or tax incentives, a young activist stood up, trembling with what the writer called a curated kind of rage, and declared the proposal the first step toward a new Holocaust.
From a zoning reform. Wow.
The room just went silent, and in that moment, the therapeutic state took over. The activist's feelings became the only valid currency in the room, and the councilman was no longer a neighbor with a different policy view, but a monster to be exorcised.
The political was transformed into the pathological.
Yes. And you just have to imagine the isolation of that councilman who went home realizing that in this culture of narcissism, there is no middle ground, only the binary of the saint and the Nazi. Reading this, I can't help but notice how we've traded rational critique for what feels like immediate moral dopamine.
It's a powerful drug.
It's effective for social media engagement, perhaps, but it's the death of compromise. It makes me wonder if we are so addicted to our own moral reflection that we've forgotten how to live with people who aren't our mirrors.
That's a deep and troubling question.
Curated rage. I feel like I've seen that performance 1,000 times. But let's unpack this term, the therapeutic state. It sounds like a government run by psychiatrists.
It's a concept developed by thinkers like Christopher Lasch and James Nolan. The core idea is that the state used to primarily treat us as citizens.
Meaning we have rights, we have responsibilities, we vote, we pay taxes, we are political agents.
Right. We are seen as rational actors in a republic. But the therapeutic state increasingly treats us as patients, or in the modern jargon, vulnerable subjects.
So the government isn't our representative anymore, it's our doctor. Or our therapist.
And our protector. The primary lens for viewing social problems shifts from the language of justice, liberty, or rights to the language of health, trauma, and safety.
Well, hang on. I like being safe. I like health.
It's not a bad thing in a hospital or a doctor's office, but when that logic takes over politics, it leads to what social scientists call psychologization.
Okay.
Think about how we talk about disagreements now. We don't say your idea is wrong and here are the reasons. We say your idea is traumatic, or your words are violence, or your proposal makes me feel unsafe.
Everywhere, safety doesn't just mean physical safety, I won't get hit by a car. It's been expanded to mean emotional safety. I won't have to hear an opinion that upsets me.
Correct. And this logically leads to the medicalization of deviance. If you disagree with the consensus view, you aren't just a political opponent with a different but legitimate perspective. You are sick. You have a phobia. You're irrational.
Or you are a narcissist. Which brings us to Christopher Lasch. I feel like narcissism is another one of those words we've completely ruined. We use it to mean selfish jerk or someone who posts too many selfies. But Lash meant something very specific and clinical, right?
Specific. And this is crucial to understanding that story you just told about the town hall. For Lash, the narcissist isn't someone with a strong sense of self, someone who loves themselves. It's the opposite. It's someone with a very, very weak and fragile sense of self. They are an empty vessel that requires the outside world to constantly validate them and tell them who they are.
The mirror analogy you mentioned.
Yes. The narcissist looks at the world and says, you must reflect me back to me. They need constant, perfect affirmation. If the world or the town councilman with his zoning plan refuses to reflect them, if they offer a different view.
The mirror cracks.
And for the narcissist, that feels like death. It feels like an existential threat. For this fragile personality, disagreement isn't just annoying. It is experienced as an annihilation of the self.
Which explains the trembling, the rage, the jump to Holocaust.
Exactly. The intensity of the reaction seems wildly disproportionate to a zoning law, but it is perfectly proportional to the psychological threat they feel. If you aren't validating me, you're killing me. And what do you call someone who is trying to kill you?
Hitler.
Hitler.
And the state or the culture actually encourages this.
Yes. The sources discuss concepts like flexicurity and the rise of the vulnerable subject. Neoliberal systems, in a strange way, benefit from us viewing ourselves as fragile. Because if we are fragile, we need the state to manage us. We need experts to intervene in our lives. We need therapy, not politics.
So we have a population that is increasingly told they are fragile, that is trained to view any disagreement as a form of violence, and is armed with only one historical analogy, Hitler, to describe the source of that violence.
It's an incredibly combustible mix.
It feels like we are mixing chemicals in a lab that are guaranteed to explode. And it seems like that explosion just dissolves the political ground entirely. You can't have a democracy if you view your neighbor not as a fellow citizen, but as a source of contamination.
Contamination is a strong word, but it's the right one. It's Foucault's idea. If the other person's ideas are a biohazard, as you said, if they are a Nazi or a virus, you don't debate them. You don't persuade them.
You sanitize the room. You quarantine them.
You deplatform them.
Which leads us directly to our third story. We've gone from the loss of classical education to the therapeutic town hall, and now we're going to the university campus. This is where the rubber really meets the road on cancellation and ideological purity.
This is where all these threads come together.
I was reading an account of a faculty meeting at a prestigious liberal arts college where a long-standing, respected professor was deplatformed. And not for anything he did, not for any action, but for his refusal to use a specific singular analogy during a lecture on authoritarianism.
What was the analogy they wanted?
Hitler's. He wanted to discuss the bureaucratic terror of Robespierre, to draw a different comparison. But the student collective demanded he frame all historical whiteness, which was the topic, through the lens of absolute Hitlerian evil.
So any deviation from that one single analogy was unacceptable.
It was seen as a sign of ideological impurity. It was part of what the writer calls a woke crusade, where a policy disagreement, or in this case, a pedagogical disagreement, is rebranded as a moral biohazard.
The contamination model again?
Exactly. The professor was eventually forced out, silenced by a rhetoric that seeks the total dehumanization of anyone deemed impure. And you just imagine the chilling effect on a campus that was once supposed to be a marketplace of ideas, now turned into a cathedral of one angry god.
A cathedral with only one approved prayer.
I find these accounts deeply unsettling. This shift towards singular, absolute analogies acts like an acid, dissolving the common ground necessary for a functioning society. And while I understand the deep-seated and often justified desire to protect marginalized communities from the return of genuine fascism, I fear that by labeling every shadow Hitler, we are burning down the very institutions designed to keep the real darkness at bay. It feels less like progress and more like a refined academic form of tribalism, a moral biohazard. That ties right back to the medicalization idea we were just discussing. But there's a phrase in our research that I think explains this cathedral vibe perfectly. The source calls it the Church of Never Again.
Yes, this comes from the legal scholar Joseph Weiler. He argues that the slogan, never again, which is one of the most powerful and important moral slogans in human history, has morphed into something else. It's become a moral just cogence.
Well, just cogence, I definitely skipped law school. Is that like a law of physics or a law of the court?
It literally means compelling law. In international law, a just cogens norm is a fundamental rule that no country is allowed to ignore or violate. Think no genocide, no slavery, no piracy. It's an absolute non-negotiable principle.
So Weiler is saying never again has become an absolute, unbreakable moral law for our society.
A secular moral law. It's become the central dogma of a new secular religion, the Church of Never Again. If you can claim the mantle of never again, if you can successfully position yourself in your cause as the sole defenders against the new Hitler, you have absolute moral authority. You become the high priest.
And if you disagree with the high priest, like that professor who just wanted to talk about Robespierre as a different kind of evil,
then you are a heretic. You are committing blasphemy against the church. You aren't just wrong on an intellectual level. You are morally evil. This is why the students couldn't tolerate his nuance. Nuance acts like a solvent to absolute moral authority. Because if we admit that Robespierre was bad, but different from Hitler, then the never again frame doesn't fit perfectly. The analogy becomes complex. And that complexity threatens the student's absolute moral power, which is derived from the simplicity of their Hitler or saint worldview.
it's the acidic dissolution of politics. That's another phrase from the notes that really stuck with me.
It's a perfect visual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Acid doesn't distinguish. It just eats through everything. When you introduce this absolute Hitlerian moral binary into a complex system, like a university, a legislature, a society, it eats through all the connections. It eats through compromise. It eats through trust. It eats through shared reality.
Because you can't compromise with Hitler. I feel like we keep coming back to that single paralyzing point. It is the ultimate conversation stopper.
It is the end of history, in a very real way, for any particular debate. If your opponent is Hitler, the only moral action is to destroy them. As Foucault talks about, it becomes about contaminative exposure. The impure professor can't be allowed to speak because his very words might contaminate the pure students, so he must be removed, cleansed.
But there is a flip side to this coin, isn't there? We've been talking about demonizing people as Hitler, but going back to the therapeutic state, sometimes the system doesn't call you evil, it calls you crazy.
Yes. This is the other pincer in the trap. If they can't make you a monster, they'll make you a patient.
I'm looking at the case study in our notes of Subcomandante Marcos. He was the leader of the Zapatista rebels in Mexico back in the 90s. The guy in the ski mat.
No, that wouldn't have worked. Credible. So they did something much more insidious. They psychologized him. They refused to engage with his arguments about land reform. Instead, they released government reports and planted stories calling him immature. They said he was a narcissist seeking publicity. They diagnosed him from afar as mentally unstable.
They made him a patient. They turned his political rebellion into a personal pathology.
And this is the trap we are all in now. Option A, you are Hitler, absolute evil. We must destroy you. Option B, you are crazy, therapeutic object. We must medicate you, manage you, or simply ignore you as unwell.
And in neither case do we ever have to actually listen to you.
In neither case do we have a political debate. We either wage war or we provide therapy. The actual issues at stake, the zoning laws, the healthcare policy, the land rights, they just vanish into the fog.
It's a perfect system for maintaining the status quo, isn't it? If any serious challenger is immediately classified as either a monster or a lunatic, the people in charge never have to answer a tough question about their own policies.
It's the ultimate depoliticization. And that, I think, is the ultimate tragedy of this collapsed vocabulary we've been discussing. By obsessing over these labels, by seeing Hitler in every shadow and a phobia in every disagreement, we lose the ability to spot the actual mechanics of authoritarianism when they appear.
Because real authoritarianism doesn't always show up wearing a swastika and shouting at a Nuremberg rally.
Rarely does. It often looks like quiet bureaucracy. It looks like efficiency. It looks like an expansion of public safety. It looks like the therapeutic state telling you that for your own good, for your own safety, you shouldn't be allowed to say certain things or ask certain questions. When we are all scanning the horizon for monsters with horns, we completely miss the banality of the new control structures being built right in front of us.
We started with a loss. The loss of Sulla and Nero and Robespierre, the loss of our diagnostic scalpels, and we talked about how that void was immediately filled by the sledgehammer of the single Hitler comparison.
Then we discussed how the therapeutic state and this culture of narcissism made us psychologically fragile. predisposing us to turn every political disagreement into a perceived psychological violence.
And we saw how the powerful idea of never again became a kind of religious weapon, a way to enforce ideological purity, silence nuance, and dissolve the common ground beneath our feet.
It's a very sobering picture.
We've built a rhetorical world where the dial is stuck at 11, where every disagreement is the apocalypse and every opponent is the devil. But if everyone is Hitler, then no one is. And if we exhaust our ultimate word for evil on zoning laws and Twitter feuds, what word will we have left when the real thing comes back?